Good afternoon and welcome to Cold Chain Insights, the podcast that focuses everything temperature-controlled logistics for the pharmaceutical industry. My name's Thomas Hunt, and this week I'm delighted to be joined by Erica Olson, who was previously the Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chain at Gilead Sciences and held very senior roles before then as VP of Supply Chain Operations at Clinigen and Vice President of Strategy, Business Development, Global Manufacturing Supply at GSK. Erica, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Great, thank you. Such a pleasure to be with you today from snowy New York.
Well, it's great to have you on. It's a real pleasure to have you on. So I think a good place to start maybe is if you could give us a rundown of your career and some of the roles that you've done, and maybe a bit of detail on your most recent role there at Gilead.
Thank you so much. So I've had an illustrious career in supply chain and pharmaceuticals, starting in GSK, started in logistics and then increasing in terms of planning, strategy, business development, mergers, acquisitions. In Clinigen, built up their global supply chain, really focused on meeting the commercial need. We all talk about patient centricity and really focusing on how our supply chain meets the needs of our customers. So really, it's so important. And again, building a supply chain that integrates all aspects of supply chain, focusing on end-to-end supply chain from clinical trials through to commercial. So really fantastic opportunity to meet the needs of patients around the globe.
Yeah, nice, brilliant. And I wanted to start off with leadership actually as a topic, because I know it's something that you've covered previously, and you told investors to go around cross-functional teamwork, shape your approach. I think maybe possibly in the early days. So I was quite interested to understand what you meant by that and what your approach has been over the years.
Yeah, so that really started with GSK. When I first joined, I was part of Glaxo and we merged with SmithKline Beecham. So again, it was really looking at how do you bring two great companies together and really focusing on the best of both. And historically, each company had their own logistics. It was all specific to countries. And so really focusing on how do you bring a group together to really focus on that cross collaboration and really thinking about what's the best for the business, what's the best for our patients, and sometimes having to put aside some of our own particular wants and or preferences for the good of the whole. And that's really the basics of thinking about collaboration and teamwork.
Yeah, nice. And you've spent 25 years in BioPharma supply chain and started at GSK and went over to Gilead and through to Gilead. And what is the biggest shifts and changes that you've seen during that long career?
So I think, when we started, every discipline was a discipline in itself and organizations were hierarchical. And over that time, it really is about how does logistics work with planning? How does planning, logistics, procurement work together? How do you really look at your supplier relationship? And I think that's transformed over the last 25 years, and then working with IT and technology to look at how do we bring the best of all of that together. So it really, again, comes back to teamwork, collaboration, and really listening to each other in terms of what are the needs, what's our opportunities, and what solutions do we have in order to meet the needs of our patients and customers.
Yeah, nice. And if we just sort of rewind right back to those early GSK days when you took on one of those very senior roles within that business, what was one of the tough calls or challenges you had to overcome there? Is there a story that you could sort of live us back through during that time there?
Yeah, I think whenever you come to points of integration, whether that's the integration between Glaxo and SmithKline, or then when we created the Aviv partnership, or when Novartis and GSK came together to build the consumer, you're bringing together groups of people. And whenever there's groups of people, there's heritage, there's culture, there's a desire to keep what's important to individuals. So it comes back to people at the end of the day. And the biggest decisions and the toughest decisions are hard. How do you make a decision that may not please everybody. And you do that through listening, collecting feedback, really looking at solutions, and then making a decision, knowing that sometimes there will be some that don't always like the decision, but how do you get the buy-in and move forward on that?
Yeah. At BioPharma 2021, I know you discussed keeping patient centricity while changing operations partnerships during COVID. And COVID's always a really interesting time to discuss because it was so challenging for everyone. Can you just talk us through that COVID period, where you were, what it was like, and how you sort of managed it internally as a team?
Yeah, so fundamentally, Clinigen is a service. We had our own products, plus we were doing a clinical supply for customers. And we had a customer service team that was all on site. So the big change with COVID was how do you move to being remote? And I think that was the pivot moment in terms of technology and the need to be able to adapt quickly and move everything remote from a customer service perspective. Obviously, the biggest challenge through that is when you're also moving physical products. There's still that one team that's has to be on site. And really, how do you work together in terms of providing a solution for those that are going remote and keeping those that are having to work on site and motivated through that difficult period. But I think it's so fundamental in terms of how innovation, communication just did a complete ramp up in terms of what's possible. And again, that comes back to how you work together, your communication, your partnerships, your connectivity, all of that comes into play.
Yeah. I think a lot of people lent on their sort of their partners and then falling back into their SOPs and making sure they're robust. And I didn't know whether the sort of disaster plans were in place. And some people, I think, changed fundamentally after COVID, having run through that process and sort of learned a lot. And some people found actually they had quite a robust setup to deal with that situation. So there's a lot of learnings during
and I think it's a real mix. So at the end of the day, what you find is your partnerships that really work together on if you just look at your contract, you miss out on what's possible together through that period. So I think it was fundamentally an amazing opportunity to change, though hard. I mean, none of us want COVID again, but I think it fundamentally innovation and really upticked us all in terms of you can have continuity plans, but some will go out the window when something like that occurs.
Yeah. And where do you see the biggest gap, or do you think there is a gap today between patient needs and the way temperature control logistics are planned? And do you think there are improvements that should and could be made?
So I think innovation continues to occur. Patients want those medicines as close as possible to them. So I think the guiding principle is how we meet those needs, and they're forever changing. So how we did it before may change. So in terms of the gaps, I think that continues to be the area of opportunity in terms of communication, how you plan. So again, the companies that are going to be most successful are linking their logistics and their planning teams together, working with IT and procurement. And again, it comes back to that collaboration in terms of the solution is the team together finding that. And it's no longer just one partner working on that solution, but it's the integrated solution all the way along that will make us most successful. So as you talk about cold chain logistics, it's how they get the signals early on, can plan and continue to meet those needs. Because in our environment, in our sustainability agenda, in all the things that can cause disruption, the key is the information we have and how do we share it openly, visible to all in order to react.
Yeah. And I think one of the sort of weakest spots in the supply chain obviously is the last mile, and it's an area where a lot of temperature excursions tend to happen during handovers, etc. In your experience, are there things that typically go wrong more often than not in that handover period, that last mile, or are the improvements that you would like to see there?
Yeah, I think that comes back to that comes back to data and information and planning. And I think we still see it takes time to get the feedback loop and then what you do with the data. So how we can predict and use knowledge to then create solutions for the future is going to be how we adapt and change. And then, if I look at cross border and those things, it's that integrated piece. And how do we make the information we have visible and accessible to all and not be reactive, which is the gap I see is still a reaction to a disruption rather than how can we predict it and prevent it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You opened BioPharma Europe in 2024 as a keynote panel, and it was around cutting exposure to risk while staying ready for disruption and hitting sustainability goals. What's the non-negotiable then, the trade-off, and why?
Yeah, so quality and compliance is a fundamental. So you can't, those are non-negotiable, and quality is a factor of all our roles. And so I think that's where you start, and then it's how do you use innovation and technology to be far more predictive so that you can then mitigate the risks that you see. And the sustainability will then be a factor of that.
Yeah. So if you're looking at a supply chain, you're obviously putting quality at the top of the tree there, and then you're cascading below that in terms of working the other pieces through. Is that how you approach it?
I wouldn't say it's at the top of the tree. I'd say it's foundational. It's your roots.
Right.
And if you start with that as your foundation and put your processes, your people, your technology and all of that together, then you're building a foundation on which you can respond to disruption, because in supply chain some form of disruption will happen. And it's how you use the tools, your systems, your people and your functions to mitigate that and have early warning signs in order to respond.
And if we look at sort of resilience, what is a resilience practice you believe the industry still underinvests in, despite clear warning signs? Are there things that we need to be putting more effort into in that area?
So, we talk about packaging. You put more packaging around it to try and prevent it. For me, it's all about what data do you have? How do you share it? How do you share data so that it's in the hands of everybody rather than in point solutions? And I think those that will continue to evolve and be successful is knowing that your data is foundational, how you share it, and then work through that. So back to your sustainability conversation, you can have different trade routes, you can have backup plans, but again, the opportunity is how you share the data so that you can respond early.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that data is obviously the most important thing, and we're getting more and more data through, and often the amount of information we're having to handle is extreme. What can you just talk us through in terms of that piece, what you kind of want to see from your data loggers, control towers, and what are the key bits of information that you look for to build that out?
Yeah, because one of you can have so much data and then it's a needle in a haystack to pick it out. But I think we have to love the data, and then we have to build the relationships that say, what's my trigger? We know back to patients, you never want a patient without the medicine. So how is your data serving that to ensure that doesn't happen? And again, if you have an excursion, that's how do you prevent that? And so your risk profile, your sustainability needs to address where in your supply chain things are most fragile. And that's what you want to look at, is where is there a part of the supply chain that's fragile that will then potentially be a risk, and how do you mitigate that? And changing the conversation to prevention rather than reaction to, I've had this problem, now what do I do? And I think that's where data loggers, control towers will continue to play a part in terms of assessing that and providing those signals, and then having a conversation ahead of time to say, these are the risks. How do we want to mitigate the risks? And if this happens, what will we do? So your what if scenarios become very important.
Yeah, predictive monitoring and etc. Yeah, I agree. And I think it moves us quite nicely onto AI and something, and I do like to touch on, and I think it'd be a good place to go into now is back at Clinigen, you publicly backed, I think, AI-enabled multi-carrier logistics move with 7 bridges to boost resilience and reduce costs. What surprised you, good or bad, in terms of how the algorithm actually worked in real life?
Well, I think that we've touched on it again, data.
Mm-hmm.
I think your AI models, as they get more sophisticated, will be able to take data in any format and make it easier to do those things. But that was the biggest challenge. If your data doesn't fit the model, how do you work that through? And I think we're ever improving that. But I think it comes back to AI technology. We've got to love our data. We've got to really make sure that we can describe our processes with our data in order to make any of those solutions really work. And then at the end of the day, we still need people to take all of that. And I think that's what's the opportunity, is how do you look through all of these and make sure AI is taking away the manual tasks to allow us to do the predictions, the solutions, rather than the reactions.
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people we've spoken to with AI and dealing with sort of language models to handle data, or just AI to handle the amount of information coming through. Some departments are moving quite quickly into that, and some are still struggling. I think to understand what models can and can't do for them, where their risks are in terms of sharing information, where they're getting good sort of quality information back, and where maybe they're not, is getting, and where humans need to jump in and actually make that decision or police it. And I don't know if you've seen the same thing. I mean, you obviously you've lived and breathed it, so I don't know how effective you found it in those early days when you were trying to implement things.
Yeah, I think that comes back to change. And so in any organization, is how do you use this as a way to learn, to teach, to grow, and then innovate. And organizations that know it's a combination of those things and really embrace that are the ones that will then be able to use it more quickly and get the value out of it.
Yeah. And where do you think the human being is irreplaceable in that process? And where do you think AI actually has its most value?
Yeah, so I think we're going to be the ones that make the decisions. So it's how do you use the AI to get all of that data to allow humans to look at 3 scenarios rather than 50 scenarios. So how can they take out some of that numbers to then allow us to focus on what's critical and what steps we can take to reduce risk and meet the needs of patients. So I think that's where that's going, is how do you embrace that in your conversations to say, what are you doing manually?
Yeah.
A machine could do that for you, and what would that free up in terms of your time to do the added value, the decision making, the relationship building, and where's that best place to do that? And that again comes in with your partners. What information do they have? How are they using AI to then come back and give you feedback loops to make better decisions?
Yeah. Okay. And if we move on to sort of clinical supply and speed, etc., what's the hardest part of building a clinical supply team that can sort of go from phase 1 to phase 3 without issues and complexities, or making that process as smooth as possible?
Yeah. So I think again it comes back to planning, it comes back to execution, it comes back to creating a supply chain where everybody has a piece of the puzzle and needs each other to make those better decisions. So you start building that up through phase 1 to phase 3. And then your biggest challenge is, again, your forecasting. Have you got enough inventory in the right places? What do you do if you don't? How do you make sure you don't want an outcome where you end up with too much inventory or too little inventory? And so how you create that communication and feedback loop continues to be super important.
Yeah.
The challenges are the are the same through the phases. You just build it up and becomes ever more critical as you go through the phases.
Yeah. And if we stick with the clinical area, packaging is obviously always plays an important role there. And has there been a piece of packaging that's really saved time or scrap in trials that you've seen, or is there a piece of packaging or an area where you've been quite impressed by its innovation?
So I think that's, again, your labeling and your distribution is
Right.
where innovation continues to play a part, and where you need to use the data that you have, your forecasting, how you work with the teams to make sure that that's robust. So that's the space I still see as plenty of innovation to still be done, and to make sure that you don't have scrap.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And where do you see the biggest waste and returns in clinicals still? Where are the major problems that you've seen?
So I still think it comes back to inventory.
Yeah.
And you'll always want to ensure you always have patient supply. So that is fundamentally critical. So how do you, and historically you buffer that with stock, but obviously with temperature control and products, you don't have the luxury of wanting waste. How do you make sure that you have that information to avoid that? And again, that comes back to how you partner with your depots, how you partner internally and externally to ensure that smooth supply and reduce that exposure.
Yeah. Is infantry, is that a really difficult challenge to manage, or are pharmaceutical companies generally very good now at managing infantry and making sure they have a sort of, there's a certain amount of wastage that obviously you guys would allow? How effective are we at that area? It's quite interesting to understand.
Yeah. So I think it continues to be an area of opportunity, and hard for me to answer that broadly. But I've yet to hear inventory come off of a supply chain agenda, whether that's too much or too little, and that's always going to be a topic of conversation in terms of how you balance that. So that's a fundamental supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, across food and everything, isn't it? It's all these products that have got a shelf life. That's always gonna be a major issue. I just wasn't quite sure how big that problem is for that clinical area or not. But yeah, it's you've highlighted a good point there. So yeah. Trade and compliance and geopolitics. I wanted to start actually in terms of over the last, say, 10 years, how much harder do you think it has been to manage supply chains 10 years ago versus today, given the different sort of problems that we're dealing with currently? Or do you think it's quite similar because we factored in technology and other things to help us? What's your views on that?
So I think there's always going to be disruption. And so how you think about that through the end-to-end supply chain will continue to be critical.
Mm-hmm.
I think where our suppliers play a key role is when you're moving across borders. Who are your customs clearance, your delivery, your compliance in that piece? And I still see an opportunity in terms of that's not always integrated, and still that's not always integrated, and so you need specific expertise per country, which then means your partners may be different. But that's where I think there's still an industry opportunity to really figure out that piece. Now, how do you mitigate it? It's your communication, it's your control towers, and I see that still being the piece of risk. When things get stuck, what do you do?
Yeah. And you've highlighted hiring global trade compliance leadership previously, I know. And how should compliance partner with supply chain day to day? How does that relationship work, and where do you see the real value in the compliance leadership roles?
So I think the supply chains that integrate that into day-to-day activities as part of teamwork are the ones that will continue to be most successful. So for me, it's integrating. However, and organizations do it differently across the piece, and that's okay. It's the communication and the teamwork as to how to make that most effective. But that will continue to be a really critical area of expertise. And so it's how you create the teams that integrate into the wider supply chain teams that create that robustness that will be successful.
Yeah. And for temperature controlled lanes crossing multiple regions and in and out of, obviously, some areas are very difficult to go through with limited infrastructure and some are not. What's the smart preparation a team can do before that first shipment moves? What are the critical checks that you would want to see?
Yeah, I think for any new lane and for any fragile supply chain, you're going through that process. So where are the handoffs and what's the communication? So back to data, you don't want every second to have a communication. What you want is to have identified where there may be potential problems, and you want that signal to say, that went through well, no need to worry. So it's that exception management and how you then respond. So any of those new lanes need to be mapped out and agreed upon in terms of this is what we want to see when we want to see it, and have that mapped out and planned ahead of time.
Yeah. And so you're mapping out then your data log of readouts and your alerts with your partners in terms of what you do and don't want to see, and you're sort of weeding out the information that's sort of not of interest. And are you setting tolerance into those readings so you're only seeing the critical information? Is that how you would typically manage things?
Yeah, I think, again, you can get so much data that it then doesn't end up allowing you to make the right decisions when you need to. So it really is about, I want to know this in order to be able to respond. So back to tolerances, that's all about mapping out your lanes and your touch points to decide on that. And that's where I think partnerships really come in, because, those that are moving it for you should have vast amount of data and know the risk points. And that's what you're expecting from your partners is not to just be telling them what you want, but they should be saying, this is what we've seen as best practice, this is how it works, and have that two-way conversation. So it's far more collaboration and partnership rather than a we want this, you do this, but a two-way conversation in terms of win-win and solutions.
Yeah, nice. Okay. And with customs, what's one custom snag you still see too often? Because for us, it's always an area where we have concerns, and there are delays obviously in there. And are there ways to fix it or better ways to run things, do you think, in that area?
So you'll always get a snag if your paperwork isn't correct. And so it really is having that knowledge per country, because it's uniform. And so it really is having that knowledge, that country knowledge. And really, again, back to where do you set that up? You set that up in the beginning. You have that conversation. And again, then you're monitoring and checking that you have the right paperwork, because that's what when do the snags happen? It comes down to paperwork. Missing paperwork's no longer the issue, but it's, is it correct based on the country's requirements?
Yeah. And obviously you've led teams, and leadership's one of the areas that you obviously are very good at and have sort of fallen on your career. When you're hiring someone in one of your teams, what are you looking for in terms of the ability to handle pressure, be good at the role, and be a good member of the organization or the team that you're trying to build?
So I think that comes back to the difference between I and we and our. And again, I think what's changed over time is I'm part of a team. It's our joint accountability to deliver what we need to our customers. So the technical capability is a given. You don't get to any of these roles without that. The key is how do you play as a team? How do you win as a team? And how do you look for the win-win solutions, whether that's internally, whether that's with external partners, and ultimately, if you do that, then you're delivering your patient centricity that you want.
Yeah. Is there a certain characteristics you look for if you're hiring for a sort of someone who sits within your team managing cold chain?
Yeah, so I think that comes back to collaboration, accountability, and cold chain. You're always at the end of the supply chain, so you're often that role that's trying to catch up, speed up, deliver something that may be hard to achieve. So again, it comes back to what's that characteristic of communication, talking about what's possible, setting realistic expectations, delighting customers, equally having a way of knowing that sometimes that you'll have an answer that they won't like, but how do you deliver that? And that's all about timely communication. So back to the characteristics, it is around how do you things work well when it's all going well.
Yeah.
How do you work through when things aren't like that? I mean, I love supply chain, and obviously on a day-to-day basis, it goes well most of the time.
Yeah. You find out a lot about people when it doesn't, I suppose, don't you?
It's that 1%. How do you deal with it? I think you always plan for success. You want success, but the key for me is looking for team players, because it's how do you join all the dots, deliver and communicate well. So it really, for me, it's that characteristic of humility that says it's not I, it's we, it's our.
Yeah.
And how do you see that in their outcomes and their success?
Yeah, for sure. Good traits for any team member, I think.
Yeah.
So good. I know we're sort of running slightly thin on time, so I just wanted to finish on a couple of last sort of quick fire questions, if I may. One cold chain habit you wish the industry would drop this year?
So again, I think that's all around. We still do so much manually. So focus on how can innovation stop the manual, and then the other continues to be waste and reuse. So I've given you 2 because I can't choose.
Very good. Supplier behavior that instantly builds trust. What do you want to see from your suppliers instantly?
So for me, it's communication. If it's the don't wait, don't hope something will change. It's that early visibility that builds trust. And I think those that over communicate. I always think if you over communicate, somebody can come back and say, oh, that's too much information. But nobody ever says less communication, please. They always ask for more communication rather than less communication.
Yeah. Okay. And then what's the question I didn't ask that I should have?
So we touched on quality. I always think at the basis of cold chain is a quality mindset. So that would be the one thing that I thought, oh, he hasn't asked me. We touched on it because I brought it up, because it's important to me, and that's the team again when we think about all of the teams that we've talked about in terms of IT, procurement, planning, logistics. Quality is a key part of the success of a well-run cold chain logistics team.
Yeah, great. Erica, it's been a really interesting conversation, and thank you for taking the time. I think we've covered a huge amount of information there, and as I say, I appreciate you spending the time and running us through those points.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Good. It's great having you on. So you've been listening to Cold Chain Insights. My name's Thomas Hunt. Please tune in next week for our next guest. I look forward to seeing you then.